sound.
Assuming you want me to use the mic. All right. Well, good morning. Thank you. So I'm going to do things a little bit differently than probably everybody else today. I figured what I would do today is just kind of give one of my extension presentations I've been giving all winter to growers and soybean growers across the state. And it's going to take some interaction as well. So it's going to be a little bit different. I basically have 150 or so slides. We're not going to get through all of them. So it'll make sense here in a minute. So essentially what I'd like to do is just give some general updates, let the crowd choose what we're actually talking about. But before that, I have to do my shameless plugs. If you like podcasts and if you like weeds, I have one for you. So the War Against Weeds is a podcast I started with collaborators in Kansas State and University of Missouri. So about a half hour weekly of just a different topic in weed science. And of course, with those three states, we have a lot of talk about soybeans as well and weed control in soybeans. So I recommend taking a listen to it. So we're currently on our third season and we'll be wrapping up the third season here in April. So pretty fun way to do extension in a different format. And then, like I said, I usually bring this to growers meetings. So then I put my contact info and an electronic version of the weed control guide. Here's where we get some interaction. So I've decided to go this route this winter with extension talks because really at the production level, there's so many unknowns when it comes to weed control this winter, more so than past winters, with herbicide shortages, prices just going through the roof on a lot of different inputs, especially on the weed science side. And so I basically have a number of different topics that are in gold, and then the crowd gets to choose which one we talk about first. So with each one, I have basically maybe 5 to 15 slides or 20 slides for any given topic that we'll go through. And then once we get to the end, we go back to the beginning, move on for that topic and never address it again. So who wants to pick a topic? Darby. Palmer. All right. Can you click on the Palmer for me? Okay. So what I basically have done here is Palmer amaranth. I should probably give a little bit more exposition for this room too. So Palmer amaranth nationally is basically ranked as the worst weed in soybean. We first found it in North Dakota in 2018. We've since found it in 14 counties across the state. And this field here is the worst field that we have found to date. And so in this field here on the left, of course, obviously corn. This is actually soybeans under all that Palmer. On the right there, where it's more of a brown color, that's the soybean senescent in that field. So we actually have some research on this site. And what I've been presenting across the state is this is basically a really good case study for us because we have a lot of Palmer to work with, good relationship with the grower, and we've done quite a bit of greenhouse and field research on this population. Yep. All right, there we go. So I mentioned first found in 2018, about 14 counties. Just if you're curious, those are the counties that we have found it in that are colored in different ways. It is officially listed as a noxious weed in our state. So the Department of Agriculture are the curators of this map. And so until November, they had counties, the colors represented the year that Palmer was found in those counties. They have since redone the map where basically if it's a green county, we know there's Palmer there. And basically in the last 5 years, we found Palmer and we can still find it as of last summer. The blue counties are where we have found Palmer in one of those years along the way. And then at least 2 years in a row, we have not found additional Palmer infestations at those original sites. So feeling pretty confident we actually cleaned up the sites in those blue counties. Red counties were new detections in 2021. And so if a county is striped, for instance, Cass, where we're standing at is striped, green and red, that means we have one older infestation that plants are still there. Then we found a second new one in 2021. So again, just giving you some background on where it is in the state. The population I'll be talking about for these results is in Barnes County. And this is a really good case study for us. And so basically one of our ways we've had Palmer introduced in high volumes in the state is through sunflower screenings used for cattle feed. And so we've got, of course, several sunflower processing plants across the state. A couple of them import sunflowers from states like Kansas, Texas, other states that produce sunflowers and have Palmer amaranth as a major issue. As they clean out to get the sunflowers need for oil or confection, whatever their end use is, the screenings they can use as cattle feed, pretty cheap. So that's where we've had this infestation come from, is the farmer was purchasing some of these sunflower screenings for feed that had quite a bit of Palmer amaranth seed in them. So we were first called to this site in 2020, collected a bunch of Palmer amaranth seed that year and the pure screenings themselves, and have screened them for resistance in the greenhouse over the past 2 years, and we have field trials. And so I've basically tried to quickly summarize some of the resistance screening we've done in the greenhouse. And then in the field, we have about 22 different field trials last year. Kind of summarize some of the basic results of what we found in the field. Primarily focused corn, soybean, dry bean. So I have the slides for all. I'll probably just focus just on soybean for today. So as far as resistance, and so again, maybe a little bit more exposition. So one of the reasons why Palmer amaranth is listed as the worst weed in soybeans in the US is because of herbicide resistance. And so if you add up all the different herbicide sites of action, so the different ways that it can affect and kill a plant that we have in soybean production across the US, we have resistance to all of them. And in some states, there might be at least one population that has resistance to all 9 sites of action we can use in soybean in the same field. We're not that lucky or unlucky, but as I'll show you, we're getting pretty close just by happenstance with this population. So we did a couple of different resistance screenings. And basically how we do this is we'll grow the plants in the greenhouse in containers, small containers, grow them to 3 inches. And then when they're at 3 inches tall, we spray them with different herbicides representing different sites of action. And we just have to standardize the carrier volume of what we typically spray in soybean, or what we recommend spraying. So with the different sites of action, we've simplified this over the last decade or so as a weed science society and just give them site numbers. So rather than get into the heavy science with farmers and growers, for instance, glyphosate, I can say it's a EP-SPS inhibitor, and we can talk biochemistry all day, or we say that's a site of action 9, and we use this for extension purposes. So that's what the site of action means. It's just a number assigned to the site of action the herbicide binds to or inhibits. And then typical field rates that we might use in North Dakota, for these screenings, we do a 1x rate and a 3x rate of those herbicides. So this represents 6 different herbicides. 5 of them we use in soybean, and atrazine we use a lot in corn. And so we basically, again, 3 inches, it's when we spray the Palmer, and then come back 7, 14, 21 days after and rate them. And typically what we will report in weed science is visual or visible control from a 0 to 100% scale. 100 means plant death, 0 means no injury whatsoever. And the main takeaways that I have for this slide, we have all of our different herbicides at a 1x and a 3x rate across the x-axis. And basically, a couple of takeaways are none of them are 0. In that case, all these herbicides across all of our data did have some effect on Palmer. This population from Barnes County, only one of them controlled 100% of the plants we sprayed, though, and that was a 3x rate of a soybean herbicide from Mesofin, which we trade names will be Flexstar Reflex for those more familiar with trade names. So rather than focusing on a lot of the injury data, what I actually like to prefer to show, since we're looking for resistance, is the percent of individual plants that survived that treatment. And so for this type of testing, we usually do 10 replicates per experimental run, at least 2 experimental runs. So each one of these bars could represent up to 20 plants. So out of 20 plants, what percentage survived that treatment? And this is, I think, just a more effective way to look at potential resistance. So for instance, here's our 1x rate of glyphosate that we use on most of our soybean acres. 55% of those plants that were sprayed survived that treatment. So then that's basically the setup for this chart. As I look across the board, then we look at some of our more problematic ones. So Amazamox, which is Raptor, the trade name, used a lot in the 90s, and then we still get quite a bit of use out of it in dry beans here. Basically about 80% survived 1 and a 3x rate. So we know 80% of the population we tested, individual plants, were resistant to that chemistry. What was unexpected for us, so we basically looked at, we know most Palmer amaranth will have glyphosate and ALS or Mazamox resistance when it comes into our state, just because the rest of the US, they have a lot of that type of resistance. I wasn't really expecting over 50% of the plants to survive rates of atrazine, or that 45% survived our standard rate of dicamba, and then 73% survived our standard rate of 2,4-D. I wasn't really expecting that, which led to some more research. But just to give you a picture form, which a lot of people might prefer, when we have this is that Mazamox. I put the trade name up there since this will typically go to a grower meeting with me. 1x rate and then a 3x rate, which we can never spray in crop. But as you can see, now the one basically affected the plants. Not just do they survive, highly resistant, didn't even phase the plants that did survive. Dicamba, we know is a growth regulator, was brought to the market basically for broadleaf weed control of things like waterhemp, Palmer amaranth, or problematic broadleaf weeds. Just again, showing that some of these survivors weren't just plants that survived, they were actively growing after application with some minimal symptomology. Same thing with our standard rate of 2,4-D. So what was really surprising to me, and why we did some additional research, is that all those plants that survived atrazine, again, product we use in corn, don't talk a lot about atrazine resistance in Palmer amaranth on the national level, but we know it is there. And especially in Western Kansas, which we're pretty sure that's where this population came from. But with that atrazine resistance, what's pretty unique with Palmer amaranth and with waterhemp, so those are two pigweeds that are probably our top, they are our worst two pigweeds in the state. With most weeds, when we talk about resistance, it's usually an altered binding site. It's what we call target site resistance. The herbicide can't bind to that target site, so it's able to survive. These ones, Palmer amaranth, waterhemp, we do have cases of metabolic resistance, so that they can basically take either an individual active ingredient and metabolize it, so it survives and is resistant that way. What we often find with metabolic resistance is it's not just one herbicide that the plant is resistant to. Sometimes it's up to 9 different sites of action in a plant, potentially. And usually with atrazine, it's mostly non-target site or metabolic resistant. And then we tested other herbicides that we primarily use in corn, because oftentimes when we have a metabolic or a Palmer amaranth population with metabolic resistance to atrazine, it's also going to be resistant to this other group of chemistry. Again, for our site of action, we call it group 27. And we also, since we did not test glufosinate or Liberty, which is used quite a bit in soybean production as well, tested that one and went back and looked at 2,4-D at a higher rate. So again, same setup. This time we've decided to be a good scientist this time and show the non-treated. So it's not that typical actually that we get 100% of our weeds to survive in the greenhouse if they're not treated. So this time we actually got them. You'd be surprised how wimpy weeds are in the greenhouse. It's one of the worst things to try and grow in a greenhouse because they just don't want to live. So again, looking at percent of surviving plants, atrazine, we went with a little bit higher rate this time and still had about 50% on average survive. Atrazine, this 1 and 3x here, this is Mesotrione, which is a product called Callisto that we use in corn. Quite frequently had a high percentage survive the 1x rate there as well. And then the 2,4-D rate, we went the higher rate. So basically 1 pound of active ingredient. We're never going to spray 3 pounds of 2,4-D, maybe in a pasture, but we had plants survive that. So pretty concerning from my perspective. And again, just want to show in picture form with the atrazine survival. Again, a product we use a lot in corn. What we will typically use in North Dakota is no more than a 1/2 pound. So this is at 3x rate. What I think is important to remember if we think about on a national scale, in Kansas, 2 pounds would be their maximum rate. So 1.5 pounds is not even their full rate down there. So if this did come from that state, then we're kind of at a disadvantage with our lower rates we use for this particular product. So again, just showing plenty of survival with minimal symptomology. We still have to go in and fully characterize the resistance. There's some additional testing we have to do, some dose response curves to make this official in the eyes of other weed scientists. But every time we see reports of Mesotrione, that product Callisto that we use in corn, anytime we see reports of resistance, this is basically the phenotype that we'll see. So this class of chemistry will typically turn plants white and then they die. In this case, the leaves that were exposed at application turned a little bit white and then started growing normally afterwards. So again, we still have a few more details to wrap up before we can button that up to officially call it in the eyes of other weed scientists, but that's basically a resistant plant is what we're looking at there. And again, just a few more pictures. And here's that. I said we have one plant survive 3 pounds of 2,4-D. Again, not just survive, actually growing. Very concerning from my perspective. So that's some of the research I focused on for herbicide resistance. The other neat thing, so we added a few different tank mixes of some of these herbicides that they are resistant to see if we can control this population. Because oftentimes we'll have resistance to one herbicide active ingredient. Can we add in a second herbicide active ingredient and get control? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Of this population, we did look at a couple tank mixes that would be, in this case, some corn tank mixes and then some soybean ones. So even though we're seeing plants that are resistant to both Callisto or Mesotrione by itself, and atrazine by itself, the tank mix of the two actually controlled 100% of the plants. So I should have pointed out that of these 4 different tank mixes on the screen did provide 100% control over multiple herbicide application experiments. So even though we have resistance to both, together we still control the plants. And then because we have these issues with 2,4-D, quite a few plants surviving, we know 2,4-D plus glufosinate, brand name Liberty, is a common tank mix in soybeans. And then we can actually add a third one, glyphosate. We can use that in our Enlist soybean systems. And so those tank mixes, even though we have quite a few plants surviving resistant to 2,4-D, once we tank mix in the other products, we get complete control. So that's kind of my good message for if we have a case like this, if this type of resistance profile shows up on a different farm somewhere, we certainly seems like we have some post-emergence options to clean up these plants. And I have basically talked my way through all of that. So the last thing I wanted to do for the Palmer section, it looks like I left out the field results here, but basically we do have several programs in the field, pre-emergence herbicide applications before the crop is out of the ground, followed by post-emergence about 4 weeks later that can control this population. So that's my summary there. But the last thing that I basically tell growers are these 3 main bullet points. So one of the reasons we are concerned about Palmer amaranth, besides the herbicide resistance, which makes it very problematic to control, is other states, it's basically the most aggressive weed we have in row crops. So one of my colleagues in Arkansas will say the best herbicide program you can have for every other weed is to not control your Palmer. Because in Arkansas, at least, it will shade out the other weeds and basically becomes the dominant plant in the field. So that's another one of our concerns. Will it be that aggressive up here? This is a weed that's native to the Sonoran Desert, has basically leaked out and is now covers the whole country, essentially. So is this weed that thrives in the South going to be that problematic here, that aggressive up here? And so some important points for us. Being more of a southern weed, we did not see Palmer amaranth emerge until Memorial Day last year, which if you remember was May 31st. So it's going to be a weed that emerges late May, early June to start. So other weeds are more typical pig weeds like redroot pigweed or kochia, another problematic weed for us, emerge before this. So if you want to control Palmer, just don't control your kochia, is what we basically saw last year. So that's the one note. It's going to germinate pretty late. When we left the other weeds controlled, which we do a lot in research, again, they basically outcompeted Palmer. So kind of the inverse of what my colleagues down south would say. And then what was pretty interesting, though, is when we controlled all other weeds in an individual plot or in areas of the field, when we eliminated the other weeds from competition from Palmer amaranth, it did become this big 10-foot tall, 10-foot wide bushy plant, like the pictures we see when you Google Palmer amaranth. So pretty interesting, not competitive with our native weeds, it seems like, but if you take out the native weeds, it's going to be just as competitive potentially against crops. And we're going to do some research to see how competitive it is against soybean in the field this year to look for potential yield loss at different densities of Palmer amaranth. So a smiley face is my indicator. That's my last slide on Palmer. And we go back to the top. And I've got what? 5 minutes?
No, well, 10 minutes.
10 minutes? You should have told me 5.
I do have a question that's probably going to take you a little while to answer.
Well, if you have questions about Palmer, that's when I would tell the grower meeting, ask your questions about Palmer now, because I'm not going to say it again.
No, it is not about Palmer.
Okay. So here's another short list, or we're back to the top. And so basically one of the weeds I do a lot of research on is water hemp. That's why that's broken out into so many different subcategories. Just as we're looking through this, the enlist label updates, that's one of these things, no research behind it. But as a weed scientist now, I figured I basically have to be a label interpreter, is apparently part of my job that was never taught in grad school. So when we go out and talk to farmers, when we get a label update of an important herbicide, we kind of have to walk through and talk about that as well. So just setting up what that actually means on this slide.
Your choice.
A hint, the first 2 sub bullets under water hemp are the only ones I can get through in the 3 minutes I have left. General info on water hemp. Okay. I think this is about 3 slides. So water hemp is a very close cousin to Palmer amaranth. I lied. I said Palmer twice now, 2 more times. But it's our more problematic pigweed at this point. So certainly if you farm or do any research in the valley, if you have plots on campus, then you know how problematic water hemp can be, because that's starting to take over the fields on campus. So the counties in green are basically counties where we have confirmed water hemp is present in our state. What I still tell most people, if you draw a line from Fargo to Jamestown and go south, this corner of the state is where water hemp is one of the most problematic weeds, if not the most problematic. In some areas, far more problematic than kochia. Once you get north and west, yes, we can find water hemp, but then kochia becomes a bigger issue for most producers. But water hemp is continuing to spread, and similar to the other pigweed I just talked about, so I don't say its name again, a lot of herbicide resistance across the US and specifically in our state as well. So typically what we'll talk about, for those in Cass County, Richland County, those areas I said are water hemp country, we know what it looks like. Once you get outside of that, then we have at least 7 other common pigweeds across the state. And so identification becomes kind of an important point to talk about. And the thing with water hemp, and I'll say it again, Palmer amaranth, with those do not have hairs on their stem of the plant. All the other pigweeds we deal with will have hairs on the stem. And so one of the confusion points we'll talk about is we can say it over the phone or whatever, pick up a plant, look for hairs on the stem. And if you see hairs, it's not one of the 2 bad pigweeds. It's redroot pigweed, pal amaranth, one of the other ones we deal with. This picture is pal amaranth, so a different pigweed, the one that's pretty native to our region, still relatively easy to control compared to the other 2. Pal amaranth does have hairs on the stem, but it can be very difficult for most people to see. So I took a couple pictures and used this slide quite a lot. And basically tell people, when you look for hairs on a pigweed to try and identify the species, if you're looking for hairs on pal amaranth, you go towards the top of the plant. These white wispy things you see against that red stem, that would be the hairs that we're talking about on the stem. Oftentimes, if you don't focus people that way, in this case, if you go 6 inches further down that stem, pal amaranth, the hairs slough off as it matures. So I just use this as a general identification tip. To look for hairs, you also need to look at the very top of the plant and show, if you don't look at the very top and just go a couple inches down, a lot of people will pull it up and look at the stem right where they're holding it, where it pulled out of the ground. You're not going to see those hairs. And so we do get a lot of false identification that way, of not seeing hairs, but just people not looking in the right place. So that's the general info I basically show on that slide. The other reason why water hemp can be problematic, I didn't talk about this a whole lot, but the 2 bad pigweeds that don't have hairs on the stem, they can germinate throughout the whole season, which is not typical for most weeds we deal with. These will continue to germinate through September. Both water hemp and palm amaranth produce a lot of seed. Those 10-foot tall plants can be over 1 million seed per plant. But I've also taken a different route in trying to shock and all rather than big plants, 1 million seed. I'm showing 3-inch plants. Anyone want to guess how many seed I threshed off of this plant? Any guesses? Greg, you may have heard me say this before, so if you have, you can't participate. I haven't. I'll say 100. 100? You were close. I counted 88. So it could have been 100. I'm not the best counter. That's at least 68 more fingers and toes than I have. And so that's one of the reasons why this becomes a problem for us. So here's a 3-inch plant that we basically tracked its germination to about August 15th, and this was September 11th. Pulled this plant out and took the picture of it. And so we know we have some good control options in a crop like wheat, but what can be an issue for us is post-harvest control of this weed in a wheat field. So if we harvest any small grain crop late July, early August, there's still that window of at least 4, maybe 8 weeks until we get a killing frost, where these plants can germinate, produce more seed, and be problematic in future years. So that's just a shock and awe demo I use there. And this was another demo I decided to use this past fall. So we have a project with the United Soybean Board and several other weed scientists where we're basically testing the inputs into how effective a harvest weed seed device attached to a combine might be. If you've paid any attention to weed science, you're starting to see these in the news. It's a $80,000 piece of equipment you attach to the back of a combine. All the chaff goes through this. It's a hammer mill, grinds it up, and it's effective at killing weed seeds. So rather than all of us trying to get our hands on one of these, we're seeing how much water hemp seed is present at harvest, how much shatters as soon as the head of the combine hits it. So we're measuring head loss. We're measuring how much actually comes through the chaff that would go into that device. And we're also measuring how much gets into a grain tank, which, by the way, is a lot more than you might think. So while we were out combining this, being the good PI that I was, I let everyone else do the hard work, and I was taking videos. And so I think I can click. Yeah. So just another demo. And so this is a video I took, just a water hemp plant with a lot of mature seed heads on it. And basically down here, I took one of these 2-inch segments. And this is just the top of a plant. So this plant was about the same height that I was. Just took a 2-inch segment and then rubbed it between my fingers just to show how much seed falls off of that 2-inch segment. And so again, just another, I think, effective visualization of there's that much seed and that 2-inch segment I just threshed, and there's a lot of 2-inch segments on that plant. So I can sit here and say 1 million seed per plant, and yeah, we know 1 million's a big number, but sometimes that visualization might be more effective. Smiley face means that's the end. My clock says I'm at the end too.
Oh, that's true. Okay. So questions then?
Questions if you have. I know you want to get through the student presentations as well.
Yeah. I mean, who needs lunch? So this is more important. So let's thank Joe. Are there any questions?
If you want to get the rest, I have to come back next year.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, with that hammer mill that we can attach to the back of the combine, how effective is it on seed that small, on pigweed seeds the size of a pinhead? So there's 3 of my colleagues in Missouri, Iowa, and Arkansas do have an actual device and they're playing with it. Very effective, actually. So they're seeing it's kind of given the differences in the year, but between 70 and 97% of the pigweed seed that enters that hammer mill is no longer viable. So even though it's that small, the hammer mill is able to rough up enough of the seed coats and sometimes completely pulverize the seed that actually reduces viability a lot more than even I would have guessed.
But you're saying that some of the seed can shatter just by hitting the combine head, so obviously before it passes through the combine.
Right. Yeah. And so that's the other thing with weeds, of course, it's they're not going to hold on to their seed. We haven't bred them to do so. So we do have a lot of just natural loss due to shatter. And then when you have an aggressive incident like the combine header hitting that in the cutter bar, a lot of seed will fall off. And so That's what we're testing with the pigweeds. And those tend to retain their seed better than other weeds. So that's the other good news with the pigweed. Most seed will be retained and we won't have that much header loss. If there is shatter, then actually a lot of it falls onto the grain platform, not onto the ground. Compare that to, we might think if anyone grows small grains, has wild oat issues, wild oat may have shattered all of its seed by the time we're harvesting. So there's going to be differences in weed species and effectiveness, but all the seed that we do get into that hammer mill, we can see up to 97% of that small of a seed being ground up and no longer viable.
Okay, I have a question too.
All right.
All right. So in North Dakota, what do you think is our biggest pressure in the soybean field? Kochia, Palmer, or dicamba drift? I have to. I'm so angry about it.
Where are you at?
Yeah, right. Well, it seems like dicamba tolerant extend are going all throughout the state now, even out west.
Yeah, so we have extend soybeans throughout the state. And so anytime you have extend soybeans and make the application of dicamba, we can't have our off-target movement occur. If you're talking what causes more yield loss, it's always going to be the weeds, unless you have a direct drift event across the whole field. So off-target movement of dicamba, we have a lot of injury on soybean fields that are non-extend tolerant. And so we will have phenotypic responses. And what concerns me more as a weed scientist is delayed canopy closure that no one ever talks about with that. But as far as yield loss, the only time we can consistently measure yield loss is when there's a height reduction compared to a non-treated plant, which on the commercial scale, we don't often have a non-treated plant. Can there be yield loss through lower exposure rates? Yes and no. The one thing we can the one treatment we can apply consistently to maybe gain back some of that yield would be water. So,
really?
Yeah, so that worked well last year, didn't it?
That's true. Well. Don't tell Missouri that the dicamba drift doesn't cause yield loss.
And there are differences in soybean sensitivities in the germplasm. And so your plots are probably one of the better indicators of finding what's sensitive, what's more sensitive, what's less sensitive if you get hit with an off-target movement event. And it can cause yield loss, but the data from Missouri, my colleague there, is basically, the water is the only thing after an exposure event. If you can pour on water, you can basically get it so we don't see any significant yield loss. If you have a drought throughout the growing season, and any stress, so that exposure event can amplify any other stresses. So it's basically why water works, is we're alleviating the drought stress and adding to a potential yield anyways. Yeah.
So like the drought problem in my area, how many pulse dicamba there were before?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question that has been debated before I was born, at least, as long as dicamba and soybeans have coexisted. And so, from my basic understanding and talking to other colleagues, and maybe the soybean people in the room, I don't think we've ever had any proof that dry conditions themselves will cause cupping of a soybean, but a 1/20,000th X rate of dicamba exposure can cause some cupping symptoms as well. So from a lot of what my other older, wiser weed science colleagues will say is a lot of times it's actually just very low exposure rates, and we don't know where it's coming from to dicamba, eliciting some sort of cupping. The other issue we have is so this is where I get into the policy side of my job, I guess. But we applied dicamba to a lot more areas than just extend soybeans. Other crops, right of ways. So dicamba is pretty popular to use for noxious weed control as well. So within any given county, we're going to have some dicamba applied basically during the time where we see cupping as well. So I don't think that the drought itself is causing cupping. It's probably some low exposure. The issue is that most times whenever we have some sort of dicamba off-target movement, it's hard to pinpoint where it came from because any herbicide can move miles. And if for a drift event, if you spray into an inversion, And of course, with dicamba can volatilize, it can move potentially miles. In Missouri, there's some evidence, well, a published paper that they can find dicamba in rainwater as well. So high use areas, we can actually eat enough dicamba that find it in rainwater. So that's another, maybe it wasn't sprayed within a 10-mile radius, but if it's enough, if it's somewhere in the atmosphere and comes out during a rainfall event, we can get exposure that way. So did I complicate that enough? Yeah, so initial movement, and I should, just for the other people, I should back up. So dicamba is one of our more volatile herbicides. So after you spray it, it can, due to high vapor pressure, and then the environment can go straight into a gas form. So you might hear volatility gassing off. Most volatility occurs the afternoon of the application. And then the second, so this is another thing we get that will measure, collect dicamba in the atmosphere or in the field that we apply it in. And we see these peaks in the afternoons after application. And so basically the first afternoon or the first day you apply, you'll have most volatility then, followed by the second day. You'll have volatility then as well. But we can track it volatilizing off field at least out to 7 days is what we've been able to track through that type of experiment. The best thing is if you got about a quarter to a half inch of rainfall, that stops volatility. That'll wash it either off the plant surfaces or into the soil enough, and it won't volatilize from there.